The crimson trail of blood stood out starkly against the sun-bleached dirt, stretching across the barren landscape like a macabre beacon in the fading light of dusk. Garrett Pierce followed it with grim determination, his weathered face set in hard lines as he tracked the uneven path through the scrubby terrain of Nebraska's unforgiving plains. Someone was hurt, badly from the look of it, and they were heading toward an old abandoned homestead that stood like a forgotten sentinel on the horizon. It was the spring of 1878, and Kearney, Nebraska, was still feeling the growing pains of a town caught between its wild frontier past and the promise of civilization brought by the railroad. Garrett had come to know every inch of the surrounding territory during his 5 years as a ranch hand at the Lazy S, learning to read the land as easily as some men read books. The blood trail grew heavier as he approached the dilapidated shack, its wooden frame gray and splintered from years of neglect. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he dismounted from his dappled gray stallion Silver. "Hello," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the empty stretch of land. No answer came from within the shack, but his keen ears caught the faint sound of labored breathing. With cautious steps, he approached the doorway that hung askew on rusted hinges. The interior was cast in shadow, but there was enough light to make out a crumpled form in the corner. A woman lay there, her dress soaked in blood, her face pale as moonlight. "Madam," Garrett knelt beside her, removing his hat. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of warm honey. Despite the pain etched into her features, there was a fierce determination in those eyes that caught him off guard. "Don't let him find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please. Who did this to you?" Garrett asked, already assessing her wounds. A nasty gash ran along her side, bleeding steadily. "Never mind that now, we need to get you help." "No, doctor," she insisted, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "He'll look there first." Garrett nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her situation without knowing the details. "What's your name, madam?" "Charlotte," she murmured, her grip weakening. "Charlotte James. Miss James, I'm Garrett Pierce. I'm going to help you, but we need to stop this bleeding first." He worked quickly, tearing strips from his own shirt to fashion a makeshift bandage. The wound was deep but had missed anything vital as far as he could tell. Still, she had lost a lot of blood, and infection was a real danger in these conditions. "I have a cabin," he told her as he worked. "It's isolated up in the foothills about 10 miles from here. No one would think to look for you there." Charlotte's eyes searched his face, looking for something trustworthiness, perhaps, or decency. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her as she gave a slight nod. "Why?" she began, but the effort of speaking seemed too much. "Why am I helping?" Garrett finished for her, securing the last of the bandages. "Because it's what decent folks do, Miss James, and because whoever did this to you doesn't deserve to get away with it." He lifted her as gently as possible, noticing how she bit her lip to keep from crying out in pain. She was light in his arms, but there was a resilience about her that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being the victim. "I'll need to get you on my horse," he explained, carrying her outside. "It won't be comfortable, but we need to move quickly before night falls completely." Charlotte nodded against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. "Thank you," she whispered. Garrett settled her on Silver, mounting behind her to support her weight against him. "Hold on, Miss James. It's going to be a rough ride." As they set off toward the foothills, the sun dipping below the horizon behind them, Garrett couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble this woman was in and what kind of storm he might have just ridden into by helping her. The journey to Garrett's cabin was arduous. Every jolt of the horse's movement caused Charlotte to wince, though she made hardly a sound. The plains gave way to gently rolling hills, and eventually the terrain became more wooded as they ascended into the foothills. All the while, Garrett kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings and on the woman who leaned against him, occasionally checking to ensure she hadn't lost consciousness. "Not much further now," he assured her as the outline of his modest cabin came into view, nestled among a stand of pines that provided natural shelter from the elements. Charlotte stirred slightly. "Are we alone out here?" Her voice was thin but had regained some strength. "Nearest neighbor's 5 miles away," Garrett replied, "and he minds his business just as I mind mine. You'll be safe here." The cabin was sturdy but simple, a testament to Garrett's practical nature. He had built it himself 3 years ago when he tired of sharing bunkhouses with other cowhands. The single room contained a cast iron stove, a roughly hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves stocked with essentials. A small lean-to attached to the side served as storage and a place to keep his tools. Carrying Charlotte inside, he laid her gently on his bed. "I need to light the lamp and get a fire going," he explained. "Then I'll have a proper look at that wound." Working efficiently, Garrett soon had the cabin illuminated and warming. He gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, whiskey for disinfecting, and his limited medical supplies, remnants from his days riding with a cattle outfit that had seen its share of injuries. "This is going to hurt," he warned as he carefully removed the blood-soaked bandages. "But I need to clean it properly." Charlotte nodded, her jaw set firmly. "I'm no stranger to pain, Mr. Pierce." "Garrett," he corrected her, wetting a cloth. "If I'm going to be playing doctor, we might as well drop the formalities." As he worked to clean the wound, revealing a 6-inch laceration along her side, Garrett noticed other marks on her skin, older bruises in various stages of healing. His expression darkened, but he kept his thoughts to himself for the moment. "Knife wound," he observed instead, dabbing at the gash. "Clean cut at least, doesn't look like it hit anything vital, but you've lost a fair amount of blood." "He was aiming for my heart," Charlotte said matter-of-factly. "I moved at the last second." Garrett paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Who's he, Miss James?" She hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. "Charlotte," she finally said, "and it's complicated." "It usually is," Garrett replied, uncorking the whiskey bottle. "This part's going to be the worst. You might want to take a swig first." Charlotte accepted the bottle, taking a small sip and grimacing at the burn. "Not much of a drinker," she admitted. "That's probably a good thing," he said with a hint of a smile. "Now brace yourself." When the whiskey hit the open wound, Charlotte's entire body tensed, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she gripped the edge of the bed with white knuckles and breathed through gritted teeth. "You're doing well," Garrett assured her, working quickly to stitch the wound closed with a needle and thread he had sterilized in the flame of the lamp. His hands were large and calloused from years of ranch work, but his movements were surprisingly deft and gentle. "Where'd you learn to do this?" Charlotte asked, clearly trying to distract herself from the pain. 5 years with the cavalry during the war," Garrett explained. "When our surgeon had too many wounded, he'd draft anyone with steady hands. I saw enough men patched up to learn the basics." He tied off the last stitch and began applying a clean bandage. "It's not pretty, but it'll hold." Charlotte studied his face as he worked, noting the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the streaks of silver at his temples that belied his otherwise youthful appearance. He couldn't be much past 35, she guessed. "Why do you live alone out here?" she asked quietly. Garrett's hands paused momentarily. "Some men aren't cut out for town life," he answered simply, finishing with the bandage. "Now you need to rest. I'll fix something for us to eat." As he moved to the stove, Charlotte called after him. "Garrett," when he turned, she continued, "Thank you." Most men would have ridden past that shack without a second thought. Something flickered in his gray-blue eyes, a sadness, perhaps, or a memory. "I'm not most men, Charlotte, for better or worse." He turned back to his task, leaving her to wonder about the story behind those words. While Garrett prepared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, Charlotte drifted in and out of consciousness, her body demanding rest to begin healing. The cabin filled with the comforting aroma of food cooking, and outside, the first stars appeared in the clear Nebraska sky, watching over the unlikely pair brought together by violence and chance. When Charlotte next opened her eyes, the cabin was dim, illuminated only by the glow from the banked fire in the stove and a single lantern turned low. Garrett sat at the table, cleaning his revolver by the meager light. The familiar click and slide of metal parts was oddly comforting in the quiet night. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. Garrett looked up, setting aside his work. About 4 hours. How's the pain? Charlotte shifted slightly, wincing. Manageable. I'm thirsty, though. He rose immediately, bringing her a cup of water and helping her sit up enough to drink. His hand supported her back, warm and steady. Thank you, she said after draining the cup. I didn't mean to put you out of your bed. I've slept in worse places, Garrett assured her, nodding toward a bedroll he'd laid out near the stove. Are you hungry? I kept some food warm for you. Charlotte nodded, suddenly aware of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. As Garrett brought over a plate of simple fare, she realized she couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. It's not fancy, he apologized, setting the food on her lap. It smells wonderful, she replied honestly, taking a small bite of the beans. They were flavorful with a hint of molasses and pepper, far better than she'd expected. As she ate, Garrett returned to his chair but made no move to resume cleaning his gun. Instead, he studied her with quiet intensity. I think it's time you told me what kind of trouble you're in, Charlotte. If I'm harboring you, I ought to know what I'm up against. Charlotte set down her fork, her appetite suddenly diminished. She'd known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. You're right, she conceded. You've risked enough for a stranger. Taking a deep breath, she began her story. I came to Kearney 3 months ago to work as a schoolteacher. The town had advertised for one, and I had experience teaching back in Pennsylvania. Everything seemed fine at first. The children were eager to learn, the townspeople welcoming. Her fingers traced the edge of the plate absently. 2 weeks after I arrived, I met Victor Holloway. He owns the largest cattle operation in the county and half the businesses in town. He took an interest in me, invited me to dinner, sent gifts to the schoolhouse. She paused, her expression darkening. I wasn't interested in his attentions, but he's not a man accustomed to hearing no. Garrett's jaw tightened. He knew Holloway by reputation, a man who'd built his empire through ruthless business dealings and intimidation. He did this to you? He asked, his voice low and controlled. Charlotte nodded. Yesterday he cornered me after school, said he'd been patient long enough. When I rejected him again, her voice faltered. He grabbed me, said no one refused Victor Holloway, that I'd learn my place one way or another. She took another steadying breath. I fought back, scratched his face badly enough to draw blood. That's when he pulled the knife, said if he couldn't have me, no one would. Her hand moved to her bandaged side. I managed to get away after he stabbed me. I ran and hid in that abandoned shack, hoping he'd think I'd fled town altogether. Garrett was silent for a long moment, processing her story. Finally, he asked, Does anyone in town know what happened? Charlotte gave a bitter laugh. Who would believe me over him? The sheriff plays cards with Victor every Saturday night. The mayor's daughter is married to Victor's brother. The only reason he hired a schoolteacher from back east was because no local woman would take the job. The last 3 left under mysterious circumstances. So you're alone, Garrett concluded quietly. Yes. Charlotte met his gaze directly. Until you found me. He ran a hand through his dark hair, considering their options. Holloway's not a man to give up easily. When he realizes you're not dead, he'll come looking. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door. Garrett shook his head. Don't apologize for surviving, Charlotte. You showed more courage than most men I know. He stood, his decision made. Get some rest. You're safe tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move. As he turned to go back to his bedroll, Charlotte caught his wrist. Why are you helping me, really? You don't know me. Garrett looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Maybe I know enough, he said simply. Now sleep. Morning comes early in these parts. As Charlotte settled back against the pillow, she realized that for the first time since arriving in Kearney, she felt truly safe. The pain in her side was constant but dulled by exhaustion, and the sound of Garrett's steady breathing across the room was strangely comforting as she drifted back to sleep. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the foothills, bathing Garrett's cabin in soft golden light. He had risen before first light, moving quietly so as not to disturb Charlotte, who remained deep in healing sleep. After checking on her condition, the bandages were holding well, and her forehead felt cool. A good sign that infection hadn't set in. He had slipped outside to tend to the necessary morning chores. He fed and watered Silver, gathered eggs from the small chicken coop behind the cabin, and checked his perimeter with the vigilance of a man accustomed to watching his back. Satisfied that no one had approached overnight, Garrett returned inside to find Charlotte awake and attempting to sit up. "Whoa there," he cautioned, setting down the basket of eggs and moving quickly to her side. "You shouldn't be trying to get up just yet." Charlotte grimaced but allowed him to ease her back down. "I'm not used to being idle," she explained, "and I hate imposing on you like this." "It's hardly an imposition when I brought you here," Garrett pointed out, his voice gentle despite his gruff exterior. "How's the pain this morning?" "Better," she replied, though the tightness around her eyes told him otherwise. "I think I could manage some breakfast if you're offering." Garrett nodded, moving to the stove where he already had coffee brewing. "Eggs and biscuits coming up, and you should drink plenty of water. You lost a lot of blood yesterday." As he worked preparing their meal, Charlotte observed him curiously. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than the night before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for a living. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. What struck her most, however, was the quiet efficiency of his movements, no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked. Garrett cracked eggs into a cast iron skillet. "Going on 3 years now. And before that." He glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his expression. "You're mighty curious for someone who should be resting. Curiosity keeps my mind off the pain," she countered. "Besides, you know my story. It seems fair I should know something about the man who saved my life." Garrett considered this as he stirred the eggs. "Fair enough," he conceded. "After the war, I drifted west like a lot of men did, worked cattle drives from Texas up to Kansas, then found steady work here in Nebraska at the Lazy S Ranch. Been with them 5 years now. And no family." Charlotte pressed gently. Something flickered across his face, a shadow of old pain quickly suppressed. "Had a wife once back in Missouri, Sarah. She died of fever while I was away fighting. No children." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said softly. Garrett shrugged, but the casual gesture couldn't quite mask the weight of his loss. "It was a long time ago. What about you? Any family waiting for you back in Pennsylvania?" Charlotte shook her head. "My parents died when I was 19. Influenza took them both within days of each other. I stayed on teaching at the local school until—" She hesitated. "Until circumstances made it necessary for me to seek employment elsewhere." Garrett caught her hesitation but didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private. He understood that better than most. Instead, he brought over 2 plates of steaming eggs and warm biscuits, helping Charlotte sit up against the pillows so she could eat. "Thank you," she said, accepting the plate. "For everything." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Garrett spoke again. "We need to discuss what happens next," he said, his tone serious. "Holloway isn't going to stop looking for you, especially once he realizes you're alive and might talk." Charlotte nodded, her expression grim. "I've been thinking about that. I could try to make it to the next town, take the train east with that wound." Garrett interrupted. "You'd never make it. And Holloway has connections all along the railroad. He'd have telegrams sent ahead to every station looking for you." "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, setting aside her half-eaten breakfast. Garrett considered for a moment before answering. "You stay here until you're healed enough to travel safely. I'll ride into town today, see what I can learn about Holloway's movements without raising suspicion." "That's too dangerous," Charlotte protested. "If he connects you to me, I know how to be discreet," Garrett assured her. "I go into town every couple of weeks for supplies anyway. No one will think twice about seeing me there." Charlotte looked unconvinced but seemed to recognize the logic in his plan. "What should I do while you're gone?" "Rest," he said firmly. "There's plenty of water, food in the pantry, and my shotgun by the door if you need it. I'll be back before sundown." He stood, gathering their plates, but Charlotte caught his hand. "Be careful, Garrett. Victor Holloway is not a man to underestimate." Garrett's fingers curled briefly around hers. "Neither am I, Charlotte." An hour later, Garrett was mounted on Silver and ready to depart. He had changed into his least worn shirt and trousers, wanting to appear as he normally did when visiting town. Charlotte stood in the doorway of the cabin, leaning against the frame for support. She had insisted on seeing him off despite his protestations that she should stay in bed. "Keep the door bolted," he reminded her, "and stay inside. The cabin can't be seen from the main trail, but better safe than sorry." Charlotte nodded, clutching a woolen shawl he had given her around her shoulders. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Just come back safely." Something in her voice, vulnerability mixed with genuine concern, stirred feelings in Garrett that had long been dormant. He tipped his hat to her. "Count on it, Miss James." As he rode away, Garrett couldn't help glancing back once to see Charlotte still watching from the doorway, her honey-colored eyes following his departure. He had known her less than a day, yet already her safety mattered to him more than he cared to admit. Turning his face toward Kearney, his expression hardened. He needed information, and he knew just where to start looking for it. The ride to Kearney took Garrett just over an hour at a steady pace. As the town came into view, he took a moment to observe it from a distance. Kearney had grown substantially since the Union Pacific had established a station there 10 years earlier. What had once been little more than a trading post was now a proper frontier town with a main street lined with businesses. A schoolhouse, 2 churches, and the inevitable collection of saloons that served the cowboys, railroad workers, and travelers passing through. Garrett guided Silver onto the main street, nodding politely to those he passed, but keeping his expression neutral. His first stop was the general store, where he tied his horse alongside several others at the hitching post. Inside, the store was busy with the usual morning trade. Garrett made his way to the counter where Abel Morgan, the proprietor, was weighing sugar for a customer. "Morning, Abel," Garrett greeted when it was his turn. "Well, if it ain't the hermit himself," Abel replied with a good-natured grin. The balding shopkeeper had a round face perpetually flushed from the exertion of running his busy store. "What brings you down from your mountain, Garrett?" "Ran out of coffee again." Garrett produced a list from his pocket. "That and a few other necessities. How's business?" As Abel began gathering the items on Garrett's list, they engaged in the usual small talk. Garrett was careful to keep his questions casual, working his way gradually to what he really wanted to know. "Heard there might be some excitement in town recently," he mentioned as Abel tallied his purchases. "Anything interesting happened since I was here last month?" Abel glanced around before leaning in slightly. "Well, now that you mention it, there is a bit of a stir. The school teacher's gone missing." Garrett feigned mild interest. "Missing? That pretty blonde from back east?" "That's the one, Miss James. Didn't show up to school yesterday morning. Sheriff went by her boarding house and found her room in disarray, like there'd been some kind of struggle." Abel shook his head. "Strange business. Some folks are saying she might have run off with a fella, but Mrs. Whitaker, she runs the boarding house, says all Miss James's things are still there, including her savings." "Any leads?" Garrett asked, counting out coins for his purchases. Abel shrugged. "Sheriff's asking around, but the biggest push is coming from Victor Holloway, offering a $100 reward for information on her whereabouts." Garrett kept his expression neutral despite the surge of anger he felt. "Holloway, what's his interest in a schoolteacher?" "Been courting her from what I hear," Abel replied, lowering his voice further. "Though between you and me, Miss Jessie, who works at the millinery, says she saw Miss James and Mr. Holloway arguing something fierce behind the schoolhouse the day before she disappeared. And Mr. Holloway came in that very evening with a mighty nasty scratch down his cheek, claiming he got it breaking up a tangle between his ranch hands." Garrett nodded thoughtfully, gathering his supplies. "Well, I hope she turns up safe. Thanks for the news, Abel. Always good to know what's happening in civilization while I'm up in my mountain, as you call it." Abel chuckled. "You take care now, and don't be such a stranger. Town won't bite you." With a non-committal grunt, Garrett left the store, his mind working through the information he'd gathered. It confirmed Charlotte's story, but also told him that Holloway was actively searching for her, using his influence to mobilize the town under the guise of concern. His next stop was the saloon. If he wanted to gauge the general mood and learn more about Holloway's activities, there was no better place. The Silver Dollar was already doing a brisk business despite the early hour, filled with railroad workers who had just finished the night shift and ranch hands with time to kill. Garrett ordered a whiskey at the bar, nursing it slowly as he listened to the conversations around him. Most were indeed focused on the missing schoolteacher, with theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. "I heard she was in the family way," one weathered cowboy was saying. "Probably ran off to avoid the shame." "Nah," countered another. "My sister boards at the same house, says Miss James was proper as they come. Besides, who would have had the chance to get her in trouble? She barely spoke to men outside of school matters." "Except Holloway," a third man pointed out. "He was sweet on her, something fierce. Sending flowers, waiting for her after school. Some say she didn't appreciate the attention." "Watch your tongue," the first cowboy warned, glancing around nervously. "Holloway's got ears all over town." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Garrett had heard enough. He was about to leave when a new arrival at the bar caught his attention, a tall, well-dressed man with a bandaged cut running down his left cheek. Victor Holloway. Garrett studied him discreetly. Holloway was perhaps 40, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to power. His clothes were expensive, his boots polished to a shine, and a heavy gold watch chain stretched across his vest. The scratch on his face was partially covered by a bandage but appeared deep and angry. Holloway was flanked by two men who had the unmistakable look of hired muscle. They scanned the room with watchful eyes as their employer ordered a drink. Deciding it was best not to linger, Garrett finished his whiskey and made to leave. As he turned, he accidentally bumped into one of Holloway's men. "Watch where you're going," the man growled, hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "My apologies," Garrett said evenly, making no similar move toward his own weapon despite the instinct to do so. The commotion drew Holloway's attention. His cold eyes assessed Garrett with calculated interest. "You're Pierce, aren't you, from the Lazy S?" Garrett nodded once, keeping his expression neutral. "Mr. Holloway. Don't believe we've formally met, though I know Jeremiah speaks highly of your work with horses." Holloway extended his hand, which Garrett shook briefly. "You live outside town, if I recall correctly?" "I do," Garrett confirmed, uncomfortable with Holloway's apparent knowledge of him. "Been into town recently?" Holloway asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just today," Garrett replied truthfully. "Needed supplies." Holloway nodded, seeming to accept this. "I don't suppose you've seen anything unusual in your travels?" "We have a missing schoolteacher, young, blonde, quite pretty. There's a reward for information." Garrett met Holloway's gaze steadily. "I heard about that at the general store. Haven't seen anyone matching that description, I'm afraid. I tend to keep to myself." "Yes, so I've heard," Holloway said, studying Garrett's face as if searching for deception. Finally, he seemed satisfied. "Well, if you do see anything, the sheriff would be most interested, as would I. Miss James is important to me." The possessive way he said the last phrase made Garrett's skin crawl, but he maintained his composure. "I'll keep an eye out," he promised. Knowing the irony of his words, with a final nod to Holloway, Garrett left the saloon, feeling the man's eyes on his back all the way to the door. His encounter with Charlotte's would-be killer had confirmed what he already suspected. Holloway was dangerous, powerful, and determined. The fact that he remembered Garrett's name and living situation was concerning. It suggested Holloway made it a point to know about everyone in the area, particularly those who kept to themselves. Garrett's final stop was the livery stable, where he arranged to have his horse reshod, a legitimate reason for his visit to town that would stand up to scrutiny if anyone asked. While the blacksmith worked, Garrett engaged him in conversation, gathering what additional information he could about the search for Charlotte. By mid-afternoon, Garrett had what he needed and began the journey back to his cabin. As he rode, he formulated a plan. Charlotte couldn't stay in Kearney or anywhere nearby. Holloway's influence reached too far, but she couldn't travel far in her condition either. They needed a safe place for her to heal, and then a way to get her out of Nebraska altogether without being detected. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Garrett finally approached his cabin. He slowed Silver to a walk, scanning the surroundings carefully before approaching. Everything appeared undisturbed, but a prickle of unease ran down his spine nonetheless. Years of survival had taught him to trust his instincts. Dismounting a short distance from the cabin, Garrett drew his revolver and moved forward cautiously. The door was still bolted from the inside, which was a good sign, but the silence was too complete. No movement from within, no smoke from the chimney despite the cooling afternoon. "Charlotte," he called, his voice tense. After a heart-stopping moment of silence, her reply came, barely audible. "Garrett, is that you?" "It's me," he confirmed, relief washing over him. "I'm coming in." The sound of the bolt sliding back preceded the door opening to reveal Charlotte, pale but upright, holding his shotgun with a determined expression that softened upon seeing him. "Thank God," she breathed, lowering the weapon. "I heard a rider approaching and wasn't sure." "You did right to be cautious," Garrett assured her, holstering his revolver and stepping inside. He took the shotgun gently from her hands. "You should be resting, though." "I was until about an hour ago," she explained, allowing him to guide her back to the bed. "I heard horses, at least 2, maybe 3, passing nearby. They stopped for a while, then continued on. I couldn't see them from the window, but they sounded close." Garrett's expression darkened. "Holloway's men are searching the area. I learned in town that he's offering a reward for information about you." Charlotte's face paled further. "Did anyone suspect you?" "I don't think so," Garrett said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "I spoke with Holloway himself at the saloon. He asked if I'd seen anything unusual, but seemed to accept my denial. He began unloading the supplies he'd brought. But we should prepare for the possibility that they might come back this way. Holloway knows I live alone out here." "What do we do?" Charlotte asked, fear evident in her voice despite her obvious effort to remain calm. Garrett considered their options. "First we eat," he decided. "Then we make plans. I learned some things in town that might help us." As he prepared a simple stew with some of the fresh provisions he'd purchased, Garrett recounted everything he had discovered in Kearney. Charlotte listened attentively, her honey-colored eyes growing troubled at the mention of the extensive search Holloway had organized. "The whole town thinks I've been kidnapped or worse," she said softly, "and they think Holloway is the concerned suitor." "Not everyone," Garrett corrected her. "There are whispers about the argument you had with him and suspicions about that scratch on his face. But few would dare speak against him openly." They ate their meal in contemplative silence, each lost in thought about their precarious situation. As Garrett cleared away the dishes, Charlotte spoke up. "I've been thinking," she said. "Perhaps I should just leave Nebraska altogether. Go somewhere Holloway has no influence, California perhaps, or back east under a different name." "That's likely our best option," Garrett agreed. "But not until you're stronger. That wound needs at least a week to heal enough for travel, maybe more." He hesitated, then added, "And we need to be smart about how you disappear. If you simply vanish without a trace, Holloway will never stop looking." Charlotte considered this. "What do you suggest?" "We need to create a story, evidence that you met with an accident or left willingly for a specific destination. Something that would end the search." Garrett's expression was grim. "It's not a simple problem." "No," Charlotte agreed softly. "It isn't." After a pause, she asked, "What about you, Garrett? I've brought danger to your door. Holloway isn't a man to forgive those who cross him." Garrett's lips curved in a rare smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've faced worse than Victor Holloway, Charlotte. And I wasn't planning on staying in these parts much longer anyway." This revelation surprised her. "You weren't. Where were you going?" "West," he replied, his gaze distant. "I've heard good things about the Montana territory, plenty of open land, opportunities for a man who knows horses. I've been saving to make the move come fall." Charlotte studied him thoughtfully. "You don't seem like a man who runs from trouble." "I'm not running," Garrett clarified, meeting her eyes. "Just seeking something different. After a while, every place starts to feel the same when you're alone in it." The simple honesty of his statement struck Charlotte deeply. She recognized in him the same loneliness she had carried since her parents' deaths, a quiet resignation to solitude that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable. "I understand that," she said softly. Their eyes held for a long moment, an unspoken connection forming between them, two wounded souls recognizing something of themselves in the other. Garrett was the first to look away, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. "You should rest," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Tomorrow we'll work out our next steps. I'll take the first watch tonight in case those riders return." Charlotte nodded, recognizing his need to retreat from the vulnerability of their exchange. "Wake me for the second watch. I may be injured, but I'm not helpless." Garrett smiled again, genuinely this time. "I'm beginning to see that, Miss James." As Charlotte settled back against the pillows, Garrett moved to the door, checking that it was securely bolted before taking a seat by the window with his rifle across his lap. Outside, twilight was giving way to darkness, casting long shadows across the land. Somewhere out there, men were hunting for the woman now sleeping in his bed, a woman whose courage and determination had awakened feelings in him he had thought long dead. Garrett watched the night deepen, alert for any sign of approaching danger, acutely aware that in helping Charlotte, he had made a choice that would irrevocably change the course of his life. Strangely, he found he didn't regret it. The night passed without incident, though Garrett remained vigilant. Despite Charlotte's insistence that she take a watch, he let her sleep, knowing her body needed rest to heal. By morning, she was showing definite improvement, her color better, her movements less pained, though the wound was still far from healed. Over a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, they discussed their situation more thoroughly. "I think we need to consider our immediate safety first," Garrett said, refilling Charlotte's coffee cup. "If Holloway's men are searching the area, this cabin might not remain secure for long." Charlotte nodded, absently stirring her coffee. "Do you have somewhere else we could go?" "There's an old line shack about 5 miles deeper into the foothills," Garrett replied. "It's used during the summer months when the Lazy S moves cattle to higher pasture, but it's empty now. It's more remote than this place and harder to find if you don't know the way. Can I make the journey?" Charlotte asked, glancing down at her injured side. Garrett assessed her condition with a critical eye. "If we take it slow and you ride Silver, yes, I can lead on foot. We should leave today while we have daylight." They spent the morning preparing, gathering only what was essential: food, medical supplies, bedding, and weapons. Garrett was methodical, selecting items that would leave no clear indication of where they had gone or that Charlotte had been there at all. "What about your things?" Charlotte asked as she watched him work. She had insisted on helping despite his protests, wrapping parcels of food and rolling blankets with careful precision. "Won't Holloway's men notice if it looks like you've fled? I'm only taking what we need for a few days," Garrett explained. "To anyone looking, it will appear I've gone on a short hunting trip. I often do this time of year." By early afternoon, they were ready to depart. Garrett helped Charlotte onto Silver, noting how she bit her lip against the pain but made no complaint. He secured their supplies behind the saddle, then took the reins to lead the horse on foot. "We'll stick to the creek bed for the first mile," he told her, pointing to the narrow stream that ran near his cabin. "It'll mask our tracks if anyone comes looking." The journey was slow and careful, with Garrett selecting the easiest path through the increasingly rugged terrain. The foothills gave way to steeper slopes covered in pine and aspen, the air growing cooler as they gained elevation. Charlotte remained alert despite her discomfort, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You have a soldier's awareness," Garrett observed during one of their brief rest stops. Charlotte took a sip from the canteen he offered. "My father was a Union officer. He taught me to always know my surroundings, even before the war." A shadow passed across her face. "It's a lesson that's served me well, especially recently." "Your father taught you well," Garrett said, helping her remount after their break. "We're about halfway there." The sun was beginning its westward descent when they finally reached the line shack, a simple structure built of rough-hewn logs with a single window and door. It was smaller than Garrett's cabin, but soundly constructed to withstand the harsh mountain winters. "It's not much," Garrett apologized as he helped Charlotte dismount. "It's perfect," she replied, leaning on him slightly as they approached the door. "No one would think to look for us here." Inside, the shack contained only the bare essentials: a crude bunk built into one wall, a small table with a single stool, and a stone fireplace. Garrett quickly set about making it more comfortable, laying out blankets on the bunk for Charlotte and starting a small fire to ward off the mountain chill. "We shouldn't keep the fire going after dark," he explained as he worked. "Smoke might be visible from a distance." Charlotte nodded, settling onto the bunk with visible relief. "How long do you think we'll need to stay here?" Garrett considered the question as he unpacked their supplies. "A few days at least. Give your wound more time to heal and let the initial search die down a bit. Then we can better plan your departure from Nebraska." "Our departure," Charlotte corrected him. "After all this, Holloway will surely suspect your involvement once he realizes I've truly disappeared. Your life here is compromised as well." Garrett paused, struck by the reality of her words. It was true. Once Charlotte was safely away, his own position in Kearney would become untenable. Holloway wasn't a man to forget a slight, and if he ever connected Garrett to Charlotte's escape, retribution would be swift and merciless. "Perhaps it's time for that move to Montana after all," he said with a rueful smile. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said softly. "You've lost everything because of me." Garrett shook his head, meeting her gaze directly. "I haven't lost anything that can't be replaced, Charlotte. A cabin, a job, these aren't what matter in the end." "What does matter?" she asked, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. "Doing what's right," he replied simply. "Being able to live with the man you see in the mirror each morning." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, seeing beyond the tough exterior to the depth of principle that guided him. "You're a good man, Garrett Pierce, better than most I've known." Something in her voice, a warmth, an appreciation that went beyond mere gratitude, caused an unexpected tightness in his chest. Uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts, Garrett turned his attention to securing their temporary refuge, checking the shack's perimeter and ensuring Silver was properly tethered nearby with access to grass and water. As dusk settled over the mountains, they shared a cold supper, unwilling to risk the fire after nightfall. The small space felt intimate in the gathering darkness, their conversation moving from practical concerns to more personal revelations as the night deepened. "Tell me about your life before Kearney," Garrett encouraged as they sat at the small table, a single candle between them providing just enough light to see each other's faces. Charlotte hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I was engaged once in Pennsylvania," she began, her fingers tracing patterns on the rough wooden tabletop. "To the son of the most prominent family in our town. It seemed like a good match. He was educated, charming, from an influential family. My parents were delighted." She paused, her expression growing distant. "After they died, I moved into my fiancé's family home at his mother's invitation. The wedding was to be the following spring, but then I discovered he was not the man I thought." Her voice hardened slightly. "He had a taste for gambling and other women and a temper when confronted about either." "He hurt you," Garrett stated rather than asked, a muscle tightening in his jaw. Charlotte nodded. "Once, I ended our engagement immediately. His family was furious not at him but at me for the public embarrassment. They used their influence to ensure no one in town would hire me, said I was unstable, ungrateful." The bitterness in her voice was palpable. "So I left, took a position at a school in Ohio, then another in Illinois. When I saw the advertisement for Kearney, it seemed far enough away to start fresh. Only to find another man who thought he owned you," Garrett observed quietly. "Yes," Charlotte agreed. "Perhaps I have poor judgment when it comes to men. Or perhaps too many men believe wealth and position entitle them to whatever or whoever they want," Garrett countered. The fierce protectiveness in his tone surprised even him. Charlotte looked up, meeting his gaze across the candlelit table. "Not all men, it seems." The moment between them stretched, charged with unspoken feelings. Garrett was acutely aware of her presence, her strength despite vulnerability, her intelligence, the quiet dignity with which she faced adversity. In the span of 2 days, this woman had upended his solitary existence and awakened desires he had long suppressed. Before either could speak again, a sound from outside broke the spell, a distant but distinctive crack of a branch breaking under weight. Garrett immediately extinguished the candle, plunging them into darkness. "Stay here," he whispered, drawing his revolver and moving silently to the window. Charlotte rose as well, retrieving the shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. "What is it?" she breathed, barely audible. Garrett peered into the darkness, his eyes adjusting slowly. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to make out the shapes of trees and brush surrounding the shack. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a shadow detached itself from the tree line, a man on horseback, moving cautiously toward their hideout. "One rider," Garrett murmured. "Coming in from the west." Charlotte moved to his side, her shoulder brushing his arm as she joined him at the window. "Holloway's man." "Possibly," Garrett acknowledged. "Or just a ranch hand checking the line shacks. Either way, we need to stay quiet and hope he passes by." They stood motionless in the darkness, watching as the rider approached. The man stopped about 50 yards from the shack, seeming to study it in the moonlight. Garrett could now make out enough details to confirm it wasn't anyone he recognized from town or the Lazy S. "He's armed," Garrett observed, noting the rifle in a scabbard on the horse's flank. "And looking for something specific." The rider urged his horse forward again, circling the shack slowly. When he reached the side where Silver was tethered, he stopped, clearly noting the presence of Garrett's horse. "He knows someone's here," Charlotte whispered, tension evident in her voice. Garrett nodded grimly. "Get behind the table. If he tries to enter, I'll deal with him." Charlotte positioned herself as directed but kept the shotgun ready. "I won't leave you to face this alone, Garrett." Before he could respond, the rider dismounted and approached the door. There was a moment of tense silence, then 3 sharp knocks. "Hello, the cabin," a male voice called. "I know someone's in there. I mean no harm, just looking for shelter for the night." Garrett and Charlotte exchanged glances in the darkness. It could be an innocent request or a ploy to get them to open the door. "I've got a wounded companion," the voice continued when no answer came. "We were ambushed by bandits on the North Trail. Please, we need help." The mention of a wounded companion gave Garrett pause. If the man was telling the truth, turning him away could mean death for an innocent traveler. Yet opening the door could expose Charlotte to danger. "Your companion," Garrett called through the door, keeping his voice steady. "Man or woman?" There was a hesitation that immediately put Garrett on alert. "A young man," the voice finally replied. "My nephew, he took a bullet in the shoulder." Garrett's suspicion deepened at the pause. "Bring him to the door where I can see him," he instructed, positioning himself to the side of the entrance, gun ready. Another pause, longer this time. I can't," the man admitted. "He's unconscious. I left him with the horses just beyond those trees." The voice hardened slightly. "Look, mister, I don't know what you're afraid of, but I've got a dying boy out here. Either help us or say so plainly so I can try elsewhere." The genuine frustration in the man's tone gave Garrett momentary doubt. Could they be legitimate travelers in distress? He glanced at Charlotte, whose expression reflected his own uncertainty. "Give me a moment," Garrett called, then lowered his voice to address Charlotte. "What do you think?" "I don't know," she whispered back, "but if there really is an injured boy—" Garrett nodded, coming to a decision. "Stay hidden," he told her. "I'll go out and check his story. If anything seems wrong, I'll fire a warning shot. Be ready to bar the door behind me." Charlotte looked like she wanted to protest, but nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." Garrett approached the door, keeping his revolver ready but partially concealed. "I'm coming out," he announced. "I'll help your nephew, but you stay where you are until I say otherwise." Slowly, Garrett unbolted the door and stepped outside, his eyes quickly scanning the area. The man stood about 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty, a good sign. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and trail-worn clothes that matched his story of being a traveler. "Where's your nephew?" Garrett asked, maintaining a cautious distance. The man gestured toward a copse of trees. "Over there with our horses. He's lost a lot of blood." "Lead the way," Garrett instructed, keeping the man in front of him as they moved toward the trees. As they approached the indicated spot, Garrett's unease grew. He could see no sign of additional horses or an injured boy. The man continued forward, glancing back once with an expression Garrett couldn't quite read. "Just around these trees," the man said, stepping into the shadows. Garrett followed cautiously, his senses heightened for any sign of ambush. As they rounded the cluster of pines, he saw not horses and an injured boy, but two mounted men waiting silently in the darkness, their guns already drawn. "That's him," one of the men said quietly. Holloway was right. Garrett realized the trap too late. Before he could react, a heavy blow struck the back of his head, delivered by the traveler who had circled behind him as they entered the trees. Darkness claimed him as he fell to the ground, his last conscious thought a desperate concern for Charlotte, alone and vulnerable in the lined shack. Charlotte waited tensely in the darkened shack, shotgun ready, straining to hear any sound from outside. The minutes stretched interminably with no sign of Garrett's return or the promised warning shot. Something was wrong, she could feel it with growing certainty. Cautiously, she moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit clearing. There was no movement, no sign of Garrett or the traveler with his supposedly wounded nephew. The silence was ominous. Making a quick decision, Charlotte moved to the door, bolting it securely before returning to the window. If Garrett had been ambushed, her best chance was to remain hidden and defended. She positioned herself with a clear view of the approach to the shack, the shotgun braced against her good side. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Her wound throbbed painfully from the tension and exertion, but Charlotte ignored it, focusing instead on the terrain outside. Just as she was beginning to wonder if Garrett had simply gone further than expected, movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. 3 men appeared, 2 supporting a third, between them Garrett, apparently unconscious. Charlotte's heart lurched at the sight. Behind them came a 4th figure, mounted on a horse that Charlotte recognized immediately. Victor Holloway. Forcing down her panic, Charlotte assessed her options. The shotgun was loaded with only 2 shells, and she had Garrett's revolver with 6 rounds. Against 4 armed men, her chances in a direct confrontation were slim, especially with Garrett as their hostage. The group approached the shack, stopping about 20 feet from the door. Holloway dismounted gracefully, his fine clothes incongruous in the wilderness setting. In the moonlight, the scratch on his face stood out starkly against his pale skin. "Miss James," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "I know you're in there. Your gallant protector here confirmed as much before we persuaded him to take a nap." Charlotte remained silent, though her hands tightened on the shotgun. "I must say, you've led me on quite a chase," Holloway continued conversationally. "Very resourceful, finding a man like Pierce to hide you, but ultimately futile." His tone hardened. "Come out now, Charlotte, and perhaps I'll let your cowboy live." "Don't listen to him, Charlotte." Garrett's voice suddenly rang out, apparently having regained consciousness. His warning was cut short by a vicious blow from one of his captors. "How touching," Holloway sneered. "He's still trying to protect you. Loyalty is so rare these days, don't you think, but misplaced in this instance." He gestured to his men, who forced Garrett to his knees. "I'm going to count to 5, Charlotte. If you haven't opened that door by then, Mr. Pierce gets a bullet in his leg. Then another in his arm, and so on. How much pain are you willing to let him endure for your sake?" Charlotte's mind raced. She knew Holloway would kill them both regardless of what she did, but if she surrendered immediately, they lost any chance of escape. She needed time, a distraction, anything that might create an opportunity. 1. Holloway began counting, his voice almost bored. Charlotte moved quickly to the fireplace, grabbing a piece of cloth and wrapping it around the end of a sturdy branch that lay among the kindling. 2. She struck a match, igniting the makeshift torch, its flame casting wild shadows across the shack's interior. 3. Moving back to the window, Charlotte took careful aim with the shotgun at the lantern one of Holloway's men had set on the ground near Garrett. 4. She fired. The blast shattered the lantern, spilling oil that immediately caught fire, creating a wall of flame between Holloway and his men. In the confusion, Charlotte threw open the door and tossed her blazing torch onto the dry brush nearby, creating a second fire to the right of the group. Garrett. She shouted, leveling the revolver at the nearest captor. Move. Taking advantage of the chaos, Garrett slammed his shoulder into the man holding him, breaking free as Charlotte fired twice in quick succession, forcing the other men to dive for cover. Garrett sprinted toward the shack, zigzagging to make himself a difficult target as bullets whizzed past him. Charlotte provided covering fire until Garrett reached the doorway, tumbling inside as she slammed and bolted the door behind him. "The back window," Garrett gasped, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead where he'd been struck. "We need to go now before they surround us." Working quickly despite her pain, Charlotte gathered their essential supplies while Garrett retrieved his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. The sound of gunfire outside told them Holloway's men were shooting at the shack, bullets splintering the wooden walls. "The fire's spreading," Garrett observed, glancing out the small rear window. "It'll reach the shack soon with this wind. We can use the smoke as cover, but we need to move fast." Charlotte nodded, slinging the bag of supplies over her good shoulder. "Which way?" "There's a ravine about 100 yards east," Garrett explained. "If we can reach it, we can follow it down to the creek. I have a friend with a homestead about 5 miles downstream, Daniel Woodson. He'll help us." A crash from the front of the shack indicated Holloway's men were trying to break down the door. The smell of smoke was growing stronger as the brush fire approached the dry wooden structure. "Ready?" Garrett asked, his eyes meeting Charlotte's in the dim light. She nodded, determination replacing fear in her expression. "Ready." In one fluid motion, Garrett broke the glass of the rear window with his rifle butt, cleared the remaining shards, and helped Charlotte through the opening. He followed immediately after, and together they sprinted toward the tree line. Using the growing smoke and darkness for concealment, behind them, shouts of alarm indicated their escape had been discovered. Gunshots rang out, bullets kicking up dirt around them, but the combination of smoke, darkness, and their zigzagging path kept them from being hit. They reached the edge of the ravine Garrett had mentioned, a steep-sided gully that offered both concealment and a path away from their pursuers. Garrett helped Charlotte down the slope, mindful of her injury, then followed. At the bottom, they paused to catch their breath. "Your head," Charlotte said, touching the wound on Garrett's forehead gently. "It's nothing," he assured her, though his vision occasionally blurred. "They got the drop on me. I'm sorry, Charlotte." "You have nothing to apologize for," she insisted. "You came back for me even after they captured you." A grim smile touched his lips. "I wasn't about to leave you to Holloway." The sound of men crashing through the brush above spurred them into motion again. They moved as quickly as possible along the ravine floor, putting distance between themselves and the burning line shack. The creek Garrett had mentioned was visible ahead, its water gleaming silver in the moonlight. "We need to cross here and follow the creek downstream," Garrett instructed. "The water will hide our tracks." They waded into the cold mountain stream, the shock of it momentarily taking Charlotte's breath away. Garrett supported her with a strong arm around her waist, careful of her wounded side as they crossed to the far bank. "Daniel's place is about 2 hours on foot," Garrett explained as they began moving downstream. "Can you make it?" Charlotte nodded, though her face was pale with pain and exhaustion. "I'll make it. I won't slow us down." Garrett's admiration for her resilience grew with each passing moment. Despite her wound, despite the terror of Holloway's pursuit, she pushed forward without complaint, matching his pace as best she could. They traveled in tense silence for nearly an hour, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. The creek led them down from the foothills into more gently rolling terrain, the going slightly easier but still challenging in the darkness. "We should rest briefly," Garrett suggested, noting how Charlotte was favoring her injured side. "Just for a few minutes." She didn't protest, which told him how exhausted she truly was. They found a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging bank where they could sit without being easily visible from above. "Let me check your wound," Garrett said, concern evident in his voice. Charlotte nodded, carefully lifting the edge of her shirt to reveal the bandaged gash. Garrett gently removed the dressing, relieved to see that while the area was angry and red, the stitches had held. The exertion had caused some fresh bleeding, but nothing too severe. "It's not as bad as it could be," he told her, replacing the bandage with a clean one from their hastily gathered supplies. "But we need to get you somewhere safe where you can properly rest." Charlotte caught his hand as he finished. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Garrett felt an overwhelming urge to protect this woman, not just from Holloway, but from anything that might ever harm her again. "We should keep moving," he said reluctantly, breaking the moment. "Holloway won't give up easily." They continued their journey downstream, moving more cautiously now as they approached more settled areas. The creek eventually widened, its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided additional cover. As promised, after another hour of travel, the outline of a small homestead appeared ahead, a modest cabin with a barn and corral, set back from the creek in a clearing surrounded by trees. "Daniel's place," Garrett confirmed. "He's a good man, served with me during the war. He lives alone since his wife passed last winter." "Can we trust him?" Charlotte asked, the events of the night having reinforced her caution. "With our lives," Garrett assured her. "He has no love for men like Holloway, and he's handy with a rifle if it comes to that." They approached the cabin cautiously nonetheless. A dog began barking as they drew near, alerting the occupant to their presence. The door opened, spilling lamplight onto the porch, and a tall, bearded man appeared with a shotgun at the ready. "Who's there?" he called out. "It's Garrett Pierce, Daniel," Garrett responded. "I've got a wounded woman with me. We need help." Daniel Woodson lowered his weapon immediately. "Pierce, what in tarnation are you doing out at this hour?" He stepped off the porch, approaching them. "Good Lord, you two look like you've been through hell." "Something like that," Garrett agreed grimly. "We've got trouble on our tail, Holloway's men." Daniel's expression hardened at the name. "Get inside, both of you, quickly now." He ushered them into the warm cabin, locking the door behind them and drawing the curtains across the windows. The simple space was neat and comfortable, with a fire burning low in the hearth and the remnants of a solitary dinner still on the table. "Sit down before you fall down," Daniel instructed, clearing space at the table. "The lady looks about ready to collapse." Charlotte sank gratefully into a chair, her strength finally giving out now that they had reached relative safety. While Daniel busied himself heating water and gathering clean cloths, Garrett quickly explained their situation: Charlotte's attack by Holloway, his finding her in the abandoned shack, and their subsequent flight from the line cabin. Daniel listened without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly grim. When Garrett finished, he nodded once. "You did right coming here. That bastard Holloway's had it coming for years. Ran 3 small ranchers off their land last season with similar tactics, threats, violence, and a sheriff who looks the other way." He brought over the heated water and clean cloths. "Let's tend to your wounds properly, the lady first." While Daniel helped Charlotte clean and rebandage her knife wound, Garrett paced the small cabin, checking the windows periodically. "Holloway won't give up," he said. "He'll have men watching the trails, maybe even searching along the creek." "Likely so," Daniel agreed, finishing with Charlotte's bandage. "But they won't come here immediately. They'll check the obvious places first: your cabin, the town, the main trails. That gives us some time." He turned to examine the cut on Garrett's forehead. "Not too deep, but head wounds bleed something fierce. You're lucky they didn't hit you harder." "What's your plan, Pierce?" Daniel asked as he cleaned Garrett's injury. "You can't stay in Kearney, that's certain, and the lady needs more than just hiding." Garrett nodded, having considered this during their flight. "Charlotte needs to disappear not just from Kearney but from Nebraska entirely, somewhere Holloway can't reach with his influence. And you," Daniel pressed, "you're in this as deep as she is now." "I was thinking Montana," Garrett admitted. "I've been saving for a fresh start anyway, enough to buy some land, start a small horse ranch." Charlotte spoke up, her voice tired but determined. "We need to travel separately. If Holloway's men are watching for us, they'll be looking for a man and woman together." "She's right," Daniel agreed. And the lady's in no condition for a hard journey yet anyway. Garrett considered this. The railroad would be fastest and safest for Charlotte once she's well enough. But Holloway will have men watching the station in Kearney. Grand Island, Daniel suggested. It's the next major stop east. I could take the lady there in my wagon when she's stronger, claim she's my niece visiting from back east. No one would question it. Charlotte nodded. That could work. I have money saved, not much, but enough for a ticket west. And you? Daniel asked Garrett. I'll go by horseback, Garrett decided. Slower but less conspicuous. I know the trails and I can avoid towns where Holloway might have connections. A plan began to take shape as they talked. Charlotte would remain at Daniel's homestead until her wound was sufficiently healed, then travel by wagon to Grand Island, where she would take the train west. Garrett would depart earlier, traveling cross-country on horseback toward Montana, establishing a place for them to reunite once Charlotte was safely away from Holloway's reach. As the discussion continued, Charlotte's exhaustion became increasingly evident. Daniel noticed her fighting to keep her eyes open. You two have had enough for one night, he said firmly. The lady can take my bed. Pierce, you can have the pallet by the fire. We'll talk more in the morning when you've both had some rest. Too tired to argue, Charlotte allowed herself to be led to the small bedroom. Before closing the door, she looked back at Garrett. Thank you, she said simply. Both of you. After she had gone, Daniel handed Garrett a glass of whiskey, taking one for himself. She's quite a woman, he observed, his voice low enough not to carry to the bedroom. She is, Garrett agreed, the events of the past days catching up with him as he sank into a chair by the fire. And not just a woman you're helping out of principle anymore, I'm thinking, Daniel added with the directness of an old friend. Garrett looked up sharply. What do you mean? Daniel smiled knowingly. I've known you 15 years, Pierce, seen you through the war and after. Never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her. Garrett turned his gaze to the fire, not denying his friend's observation. It doesn't matter, she needs safety, not complications. Maybe, Daniel conceded, or maybe what happened with Holloway brought you together for a reason. He drained his whiskey. Get some sleep. I'll take first watch, just in case those bastards are more clever than we give them credit for. As Daniel moved to check the windows once more, Garrett stretched out on the pallet, his body aching from the night's exertions. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was slow in coming, his mind filled with thoughts of Charlotte, her courage, her resilience, and the connection he felt with her that went beyond their shared danger. Whatever came next, he knew with certainty that his life had irrevocably changed the moment he'd followed that blood trail to the abandoned shack. The next 3 days at Daniel's homestead passed in an uneasy calm. Charlotte's condition improved steadily with proper rest and care, the wound beginning to heal cleanly without signs of infection. Garrett and Daniel maintained a vigilant watch, taking turns monitoring the approaches to the property for any sign of Holloway's men. On the evening of the 3rd day, as Charlotte sat at the kitchen table helping Daniel prepare supper, Garrett returned from scouting the surrounding area with troubling news. Riders about 2 miles south, he reported, setting his rifle by the door. 3 men moving slow like they're searching. They're being thorough, checking every homestead. Daniel's weathered face creased in concern. Holloway's men can't be certain, Garrett replied, but they're dressed like ranch hands, not locals. I'd wager they're working for him. Charlotte's hands stilled over the potatoes she had been peeling. How long before they reach us? At their current pace, sometime tomorrow afternoon, Garrett estimated. They're stopping at each place, asking questions. Daniel stroked his beard thoughtfully. We need to move up our timeline. I can take Charlotte to Grand Island tomorrow morning before those men get here. Garrett nodded in agreement. The sooner she's on a train heading west, the better. And you? Charlotte asked, her honey-colored eyes meeting his across the room. I'll head out tonight, Garrett decided. North, then west. If anyone's watching for me specifically, it'll draw attention away from your journey to Grand Island. A shadow crossed Charlotte's face at his words. Though they had discussed separating as part of their plan, the imminent reality of it seemed to affect her more deeply than she had anticipated. It's for the best, Garrett assured her, correctly reading her expression. We'll meet in Bozeman once you're safely away. Daniel tactfully busied himself at the stove, giving them a moment of privacy. Charlotte rose from the table, moving to where Garrett stood. What if something goes wrong? She asked quietly. What if we miss each other? Garrett's expression softened. I'll wait for you, however long it takes. The simple promise carried a weight beyond the immediate circumstances of their escape. Charlotte studied his face, seeming to find reassurance in what she saw there. I'll find you, she promised in return. The moment between them lingered, charged with unspoken feelings that had grown during their days together. It was Daniel's deliberate cough that finally broke the silence. Supper's ready, he announced. Let's eat, then make preparations. It's going to be a long night. The meal was a subdued affair, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey ahead. Afterward, they worked efficiently to prepare what each would need. Daniel gathered provisions for the wagon journey to Grand Island, while Garrett packed lightly for his cross-country ride north. As midnight approached, the time came for Garrett to depart. Daniel tactfully stepped outside to prepare silver, leaving Garrett and Charlotte alone in the cabin for their goodbyes. I have something for you, Garrett said, retrieving a small object from his pack. He pressed it into Charlotte's palm, a worn silver compass. It was my father's. It always points true north. Charlotte's fingers closed around it. Garrett, I can't take this, please, he insisted, for luck, and as a promise that we'll find each other again. She looked up at him, emotions warring in her expression. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You don't need to thank me, Garrett replied, his voice low. You would have done the same. Would I? Charlotte wondered aloud. I'm not sure I had that kind of courage before I met you. You've always had it, Garrett assured her. I just gave you the chance to use it. Charlotte's free hand rose to touch his face, her fingers tracing the healing cut on his forehead. Be careful, she whispered. Garrett caught her hand, holding it against his cheek for a moment. You too. The tension between them built, both aware of the feelings that had developed but neither quite ready to acknowledge them fully with their future so uncertain. Finally, Garrett leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead in a gesture that was both tender and respectful. Bozeman, he reminded her. The Western Star Hotel, I'll be waiting. Charlotte nodded, fighting back tears that threatened to fall. I'll be there, I promise. With a final squeeze of her hand, Garrett turned and walked out of the cabin to where Daniel waited with silver. The night was clear and cold, stars spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Take care of her, Garrett instructed his friend as he mounted. Daniel nodded solemnly. With my life, you just focus on getting to Bozeman in one piece. With a final glance at the cabin window where Charlotte stood watching, Garrett urged Silver forward, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow. The journey north was arduous but uneventful. Garrett kept to less traveled paths, avoiding settlements where word of his disappearance might have spread. He crossed into the Dakota Territory after 5 days of hard riding, the terrain gradually changing from the rolling plains of Nebraska to more rugged country. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Daniel had successfully reached Grand Island without incident, finding the smaller railroad station free of Holloway's men. With a portion of her savings, Charlotte purchased a ticket west, boarding a train that would take her through Wyoming Territory and ultimately to Montana. The separation was necessary but painful for both Charlotte and Garrett. Each night as they made camp under different skies, both found themselves thinking of the other, wondering if they were safe, if their plan would succeed, if they would indeed reunite as promised. For Charlotte, the train journey provided time to heal both physically and emotionally. As she watched the landscape change outside her window, the plains giving way to mountains, the settlements becoming fewer and farther between, she felt a growing sense of liberation from the fear that had dominated her life since Holloway's attack. She clutched Garrett's compass often, finding comfort in its solid weight and the knowledge that somewhere to the north, he was making his own way toward their rendezvous. The connection between them, forged in danger and strengthened by mutual respect, had become precious to her in ways she hadn't anticipated when he first found her bleeding in that abandoned shack. Garrett's journey was slower but steady. He traveled carefully, always alert for signs of pursuit, though these grew less likely the further he moved from Nebraska. The solitude gave him ample time to reflect on the dramatic changes in his life over the past 2 weeks and on the woman who had catalyzed them. He had lived alone for so long, kept his own counsel, avoided entanglements. Yet Charlotte had breached his carefully constructed defenses without even trying, awakening feelings he had thought long buried with his wife. The realization both unsettled and invigorated him. As he crossed into Montana territory, the majestic landscape seemed to mirror his expanding horizons. The peaks of distant mountains, the vast stretches of open country, the clear streams teeming with fish all reinforced his sense that this was where he was meant to be. All that was missing was Charlotte. Bozeman was a growing settlement nestled in a fertile valley, surrounded by mountains that reminded Garrett of the Colorado country he had known as a young man. The town had a bustling main street, several hotels, and the promise of opportunity for those willing to work hard. The Western Star Hotel was a modest 2-story building near the center of town. Garrett secured a room, then made discreet inquiries about land for sale in the surrounding area. Within days, he had located a promising property 100 acres with a small cabin, good water, and excellent grazing land, available at a price his savings would cover. While negotiating the purchase, Garrett kept a constant watch for Charlotte's arrival. Each day, he checked with the stage office and positioned himself where he could observe newcomers to town. The agreed-upon meeting time was approaching, and though he maintained his outward calm, inwardly his anticipation grew. On the 7th day in Bozeman, as Garrett sat on the hotel's front porch reviewing the deed to his new property, a stage arrived from the direction of the railroad station at Carine. Among the dusty passengers who disembarked was a familiar figure in a blue traveling dress. Her blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, Garrett rose slowly, his heart pounding as Charlotte looked around, finally spotting him on the porch. The smile that illuminated her face at the sight of him was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. She approached, her steps quickening as she drew closer. "You're here," she said simply when she reached him. "I said I would be," Garrett replied, drinking in the sight of her. She looked healthier than when he had last seen her. The color returned to her cheeks, her honey-colored eyes bright with life. Charlotte reached into her pocket, withdrawing his compass. "I believe this is yours," she said, offering it to him. Garrett made no move to take it. "Keep it," he told her. "It led you here safely, that's what matters." They stood looking at each other, suddenly awkward despite all they had shared. Around them, Bozeman continued its daily bustle, oblivious to the momentous reunion taking place in its midst. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Garrett admitted finally. Charlotte looked surprised. "I promised I would. People make promises they don't keep all the time," he said, a hint of his old solitary wariness surfacing. "I'm not people, Garrett," Charlotte countered gently, "and neither are you." The simple truth of her statement broke through his reserve. "No," he agreed with the beginning of a smile. "I suppose we're not." He took her carpet bag, offering his arm. "Come inside, you must be tired from your journey." "Actually," Charlotte said, resting her hand lightly on his arm, "I'd rather see this town that's to be my new home if you're willing to show me." Garrett's smile deepened at her words. "Your new home," he repeated, savoring the phrase. "I'd be honored to show it to you. And afterward, I have something else to show you, a piece of land with a view of the mountains that might interest you." "Might it?" Charlotte asked, a teasing light in her eyes. "And why would that interest me, Mr. Pierce?" "Because," he said, his voice growing serious despite his smile, "I'm hoping you might consider sharing it with me." Charlotte's expression softened. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Garrett?" "Not formally," he clarified. "Not yet. That would be presumptuous after so short an acquaintance. But I am asking if you might consider the possibility of a future together, getting to know each other properly, without blood and danger between us." Charlotte's free hand moved to cover his where it rested on her carpet bag. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "More than I can say." Relief and joy spread through Garrett at her words. "Then let's begin," he said, guiding her toward Main Street. "Bozeman awaits." They spent the afternoon exploring the town, Garrett pointing out establishments of interest and introducing Charlotte to the few acquaintances he had made during his short residence. As they walked, Charlotte shared stories of her journey west, while Garrett described the property he had purchased and his plans for raising horses there. The ease between them had returned, the connection that had begun in crisis deepening in the light of ordinary day. By unspoken agreement, they avoided mention of Holloway or Nebraska, focusing instead on the future unfolding before them. As dusk approached, Garrett drove a rented buggy out to the property he had purchased. Charlotte gasped when they crested the final rise and the land spread out before them, gently rolling meadows backed by pine-covered hills, with the jagged peaks of distant mountains forming a magnificent backdrop. "It's beautiful," she breathed as Garrett helped her down from the buggy. "I thought you'd approve," he said, watching her face as she took in the view. "The cabin needs work, but it's solid. Good bones, as they say." Charlotte turned to him, her expression earnest. "Show me." The cabin was indeed basic, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and windows that needed repair. But Charlotte walked through the space with shining eyes, touching the walls, peering out the windows at the land that stretched beyond. "It's perfect," she declared. "It has everything we need." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "We miss James." A becoming blush colored Charlotte's cheeks, but she met his gaze directly. "Yes, unless I misunderstood your invitation earlier." "You didn't misunderstand," Garrett assured her, moving closer. "But I want to be clear about what I'm asking, Charlotte. I'm not offering mere convenience or protection anymore. I'm asking you to consider a life with me as partners in every sense." Charlotte's eyes never wavered from his. "I know exactly what you're asking, Garrett, and my answer is yes. Not because you saved my life, not because I need protection, but because in the short time I've known you, I've seen the kind of man you are. A man of honor, courage, and gentleness. A man I could love." The word hung between them, neither quite ready to claim it fully, but both aware of its truth. Garrett reached out, taking her hands in his. "I never expected to find you," he said quietly. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. I made peace with solitude." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "But then I followed that blood trail to an abandoned shack, and everything changed." Charlotte smiled at the memory, transformed now from trauma to the beginning of something precious. "You found me when I most needed finding," she said softly. "And in doing so, perhaps we both found what we didn't know we were looking for." Garrett nodded, unable to deny the truth of her words. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down to kiss her, not the protective gesture of their parting at Daniel's cabin, but a real kiss, gentle yet full of promise. Charlotte met him halfway, her lips soft against his, her hands moving to rest against his chest as they shared this new intimacy. When they finally parted, both were smiling. "I should get you back to town," Garrett said reluctantly. "It's getting late." "Yes," Charlotte agreed, though she made no move to step away from him. "We have time, after all the time we need." The certainty in her voice, the confidence in their shared future, warmed Garrett more deeply than he could express. Instead of words, he offered his arm once more, leading her back to the buggy as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Montana sky. 6 months later, the cabin on Garrett's property, now their property, had been transformed. Windows had been repaired, a lean-to added for a kitchen space, and Charlotte's feminine touches softened the rustic interior with curtains, quilts, and carefully arranged wildflowers. Outside, a small garden thrived in the summer sun, and in the corral, several fine horses grazed contentedly. The Western Star Hotel's dining room was unusually busy for a Wednesday evening, filled with friends and neighbors gathered for a special occasion. At the head table, Charlotte James, now Garrett Pierce, sat beside her husband of 2 months, her honey-colored eyes bright with happiness as she accepted congratulations from well-wishers. Their courtship had progressed naturally over the spring months. as they worked side by side to build their home and establish Garrett's horse breeding operation. The wedding had been small but joyful, with Daniel Woodson making the journey from Nebraska to stand as Garrett's best man and to see firsthand the happiness his friends had found together. Now, as Charlotte looked around at the community that had embraced them so warmly, she felt a sense of belonging she had not experienced since before her parents' deaths. Bozeman was truly home, not just the town, but the life she and Garrett had created together. Happy. Garrett asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. Charlotte turned to him, placing her hand over his. Completely, she assured him. I was just thinking about how far we've come, Garrett nodded, understanding her meaning. They rarely spoke of Nebraska or Victor Holloway anymore, but the experience had shaped them both, bringing them together and forging a bond that had only strengthened with time. Any regrets? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Charlotte shook her head. Not one. Every step led me here to you. She squeezed his hand. What about you? Do you miss your solitude sometimes? A slow smile spread across Garrett's face. Not for a moment, he replied honestly. Turns out I wasn't meant for solitude after all. Just waiting for the right person to share my life with. The celebration continued into the evening, the reason for it a source of additional joy. Garrett's fledgling horse business had secured a contract with the U.S. Army to supply mounts for the cavalry at Fort Ellis. It was a significant achievement that would ensure their financial security for years to come. As the gathering finally began to disperse, Garrett and Charlotte thanked their guests and prepared for the ride home. The summer night was warm and clear, the road illuminated by a full moon that bathed the landscape in silver light. I received a letter from Daniel today, Charlotte mentioned as their buggy rolled toward home. He says all is quiet in Kearney. Holloway's influence has apparently waned since the new territorial judge arrived, Garrett nodded. Good news, though I doubt we'll ever return to Nebraska. No, Charlotte agreed. Our life is here now. She paused, then added with a smile, though it may soon become more complicated. Garrett glanced at her, catching something in her tone. Oh, Charlotte's hand moved to rest on her stomach, still flat but containing their future. Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We'll have a child come winter. The buggy came to an abrupt halt as Garrett absorbed her words. A child. He repeated, his voice thick with emotion. You're certain? Quite certain, Charlotte confirmed, laughing at his stunned expression. I wanted to tell you privately, away from all the celebration in town. Garrett's hand joined hers over her stomach, his face transformed with wonder. A child, he said again, softer this time. Our child. Are you pleased? Charlotte asked, though his expression made the question almost unnecessary. In answer, Garrett gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Beyond words, he murmured when they parted. Just when I think life can't get any fuller, you prove me wrong. They continued homeward, the news lending a special glow to the familiar journey. As their cabin came into view, its windows warmly lit from the lamp they had left burning, Charlotte felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. From the terror of that night in the abandoned shack to this moment of perfect contentment, their path had been unexpected but ultimately blessed. The blood trail that had led Garrett to her had been the beginning of a journey neither could have anticipated, a journey that had brought healing, love, and now the promise of new life. As Garrett helped her from the buggy, his strong hands gentle at her waist, Charlotte looked up at the star-filled Montana sky and offered a silent prayer of gratitude. For the man beside her, for the home they had built together, for the child growing within her, and for the courage that had brought them through darkness into this bright, beautiful future. Welcome home, Mrs. Pierce, Garrett said softly, drawing her close as they walked toward their cabin door. Home, Charlotte repeated, leaning into his embrace. The sweetest word in any language. And as they crossed the threshold together, leaving the door open to the summer night behind them, both knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced their past together, with love and unwavering courage. Their story had begun in blood and fear, but it would continue in joy and hope, a testament to the healing power of love and the unexpected paths that lead broken souls to wholeness. From an abandoned shack in Nebraska to a thriving homestead in Montana, their journey had come full circle, proving that even from the darkest beginnings, the most beautiful lives can bloom.